The sun over southern Arizona felt like a hammer against the concrete. Heat shimmered above the tarmac at Fort Huachuca, turning everything into a haze of tan and white. The scent of gun oil mixed with dust and sunscreen, clinging to the air in a way that made breathing feel like work. Staff Sergeant Emily Carter stood on the edge of the training yard, boots planted, uniform crisp. Despite the sweat darkening her collar, 3 students walked toward her, laughing among themselves. They were young, full of confidence that came from not yet knowing what they didn't know. One of them, Specialist Ryan Vance, gave her a quick look. His grin sharp. He asked if she was lost. Maybe supposed to be at the nurse's station. The others chuckled. The kind of laugh that tried to make someone small. Emily didn't move. She just met his eyes for a moment and said nothing. Silence was the weapon she had learned to use better than any firearm. The wind carried grit across the range, a dry whisper under the sound of distant cadence calls. In the distance, someone yelled range commands. The rhythm steady, confident. Emily let her gaze drift past the men, across the training yard, where another group was practicing movement drills. Her mind was steady, anchored by muscle memory and 1,000 repetitions of calm under pressure. What she didn't show was the flash of memory that sometimes slipped through, the sound of real gunfire in another desert. A different kind of heat. A place where hesitation cost lives. Vance muttered something about women in uniform trying too hard. His friends laughed again. But it faded when Emily didn't react. She wasn't angry. Not anymore. Anger was energy wasted on people who had never been tested. She had learned that lesson somewhere far from this base. Under a sky lit by tracer rounds instead of sunlight. Out there. She had a name that no one here would recognize. Ghost. She looked at her watch. It was 8:30 a.m. The first training brief would start soon, and she had no intention of being late. She adjusted her patrol cap, took one last look at the men still smirking, and turned toward the classroom. They didn't know her yet, but they would. By the end of the week, the desert would remember her silence. Emily Carter grew up in Billings, Montana, surrounded by the sound of wind moving through open fields and the dry crack of rifle fire from her father's makeshift range behind their house. Her father was a Marine Corps sniper instructor who believed discipline was the foundation of character. He taught her to shoot before she could ride a bike, to breathe slow, squeeze the trigger, and trust her instincts. Her mother, a school teacher hardened by rural life, added lessons of her own. She told Emily that luck never saved anyone. Only preparation did. By the time she turned 10, Emily could field strip an M4 carbine in the dark, her small hands moving with practiced precision. At 14, she could outshoot most grown men at the county range. At 16, she was quiet and focused, already carrying herself like someone who understood what pressure felt like. When she enlisted at 19, her test scores placed her among the top recruits. She didn't choose the easy path. She volunteered for the Cultural Support Team program, a newly formed unit of female soldiers trained to embed with Special Operations Forces and engage with local women and children in combat zones. The program was designed for intelligence gathering and cultural outreach, but the training was far from soft. Candidates went through the same kind of instruction used for Special Forces selection. Emily learned close quarters battle, advanced marksmanship with both rifle and pistol, tactical medicine, and navigation under stress. She failed twice, each time pushed past exhaustion, each time returning to start again. The third time, she finished in the top 15%. The instructors didn't cheer, but they nodded. That was enough. Her first deployment took her to Helmand province, Afghanistan, attached to SEAL Team 5. It was there she earned the call sign Ghost. After a mission where her calm under fire saved her team, she never told the story. She didn't need to. She didn't fight for medals or attention. She fought to be good enough that no one could ever question her place again. Back at Fort Huachuca, when Ryan Vance laughed in her face, she didn't feel anger. She had already faced worse. Real bullets. Real loss. Words meant nothing. Fort Huachuca stretched wide under the Arizona sun, a place where heat and discipline blended into one constant test of endurance. The base moved with its usual rhythm, structured and exact. Cadence calls echoed from the drill fields. The metallic clatter of weapons being cleaned drifted from the ranges, and the faint scent of gun oil hung in the air. Staff Sergeant Emily Carter had returned to uniformed life, though this time it wasn't for deployment. She was now a guest instructor in the Joint Combat Readiness Assessment, a pilot program designed to test how Army and Air Force personnel could operate together under pressure. She arrived early, the clock reading 7:15 a.m. Her steps measured as she crossed the training yard. She wore the same operational camouflage pattern uniform as everyone else. Nothing to distinguish her except the quiet confidence in her posture. No ribbons, no patches, no insignia to mark what she had done or where she had been. She preferred it that way. Let them underestimate her. Let them assume. It was always better to be the unknown variable in the room. Inside the briefing hall, the air was cooler but tense. Rows of soldiers and airmen filled the seats, all NCOs and specialists from across the services. At the front stood Captain Mark Hendricks. Tall, professional, with the kind of authority that didn't need to be loud. He introduced the program, laying out objectives about leadership, decision-making, and tactical performance. Then he gestured toward Emily, noting that she would be serving as a guest advisor with combat experience. The room stayed neutral until a low voice cut through the quiet. Ryan Vance leaned back in his chair, murmuring that her kind of combat experience probably meant handing out coffee at a forward operating base. A few quiet laughs followed. No one corrected him. The sound of the ceiling fan hummed above the silence that followed. Emily didn't flinch, didn't even turn her head. She had learned that silence could be louder than any comeback. Her eyes scanned the map on the projector, noting terrain features and entry points, as if the comment had never happened. Captain Hendricks continued talking, unaware that respect had just been tested in the room. Outside, the desert light flooded through the windows, cutting sharp lines across her uniform. Emily watched the dust swirl through the sunlight, the same way she used to watch sandstorms roll across Helmand province. Some lessons never changed. Bias, arrogance, assumption they existed in every theater, whether under a foreign flag or her own. But so did patience. She had survived worse. And soon, patience would be her sharpest weapon again. The classroom smelled faintly of dry erase markers and coffee that had been sitting too long. Captain Mark Hendricks stood at the front, facing a projection of the compound layout for the next day's exercise. The scenario was straightforward on paper: a simulated hostage rescue using simunition rounds, full protective gear, and real-time constraints. The map showed the main structure, a small courtyard, and an elevated catwalk on the eastern perimeter. Red markers outlined enemy positions. A thick blue arrow indicated the assault team's main route, a direct approach across open ground. Emily Carter sat near the middle of the room, her notebook open but untouched. She studied the map carefully, tracing the terrain features in her mind. The plan looked clean. But clean didn't always mean smart. She waited until Hendricks finished explaining the timing and rules of engagement before raising her hand. Calmly, she pointed out that the approach vector left the assault team completely exposed to simulated fire from the catwalk. She suggested a northern flanking route, using the drainage ditch, which would cut exposure time by nearly 30 seconds and provide cover for the breach team. Before Hendricks could respond, Ryan Vance leaned forward in his chair, his voice sharp with sarcasm. He said that real assaults didn't work like video games, and maybe she should leave the tactics to people who had actually fired a weapon in combat. A few people chuckled quietly. Others kept their eyes on the floor, unwilling to get involved. Hendricks paused, clearly uncomfortable, then cleared his throat and moved on without addressing it. The moment passed like a small cut that would take longer to sting. Emily didn't argue. She wrote a note in her book, then closed it. Her pulse stayed even, her face unreadable. She had learned long ago that silence unsettled people more than anger. As the group filtered out of the room, she walked toward the door, stopping briefly to glance once more at the map. The open ground, the catwalk, the flawed approach. She filed it away, already picturing every movement, every mistake waiting to happen. By the time the others were laughing outside, she had already seen the outcome. Time, she thought, would make the point for her. The night over Helmand was moonless, the kind of dark that swallowed light whole. The MH-47 helicopter had dropped them just outside a small walled village, its blades fading into the distance until all that remained was the low hum of wind against their gear. The air smelled of sand, diesel, and cordite, heavy with the tension that comes before contact. Emily Carter moved in sync with the Navy SEALs around her, her M4A1 carbine steady against her shoulder, every sense tuned to the sound of movement and the faint murmur of radio traffic through her earpiece. She was part of the cultural support team attached to SEAL Team 5, tasked with securing non-combatants during raids. But everyone knew that in Helmand, roles changed fast. The breach went clean. Charges blew. The team flowed through the compound with precision. Voices called out in Dari as the SEALs cleared rooms, their beams cutting through smoke and dust. Emily held security at the rear, scanning doorways, marking corners. Her heartbeat measured. They had what they came for. Intel bags loaded, and were moving to exfil when everything changed. A burst of automatic fire ripped through the silence from the north wall. Muzzle flashes flared in the dark, like sparks from a forge. The point man called contact, and the team dropped behind the nearest cover. Emily was already moving. She spotted the first shooter silhouetted against a doorway and fired 2 rounds. Center mass. The second fighter went down after 3 controlled shots that broke through his vest plate. The third tried to flank left, crouched low in the alley. She shifted her stance, lined up her sights, and took the headshot before he cleared the corner. The fourth turned to run. 1 round, 40 meters, and he fell. 12 seconds total. The radio went quiet except for the sound of their own breathing. When the firing stopped, the SEALs turned toward her. The platoon chief gave a small nod, a look that carried both surprise and respect. He said she moved like a ghost. The name stayed with her. Back in her quarters at Fort Huachuca years later, she remembered that moment. The sweat, the sand, the silence after the fight. It wasn't pride she felt now, just understanding. In war, she had earned her name. In peace, she had to earn it again. The sun had barely broken over the mountains when the training yard came alive with movement. It was 600 hours. The air cool but heavy with desert dust. The sound of cadence calls carried from the distant drill field, mixing with the metallic clank of gear being checked and magazines loaded with simunition rounds. 60 students stood in formation, divided into 10 6-person teams. Their assignment was simple on paper but punishing in execution. Infiltrate amok enemy compound. Neutralize threats. Rescue a dummy hostage. And exfiltrate under simulated fire. The range safety officer called out the setup procedures while instructors confirmed comms checks and safety protocols. When the signal came, range hot, the training area transformed from quiet order to chaos. Emily Carter stood a few yards back, clipboard in hand. Her task was to observe and evaluate performance, not participate. She wore full protective gear, but no weapon. Her expression calm, detached. The first team entered the compound at 7:15 a.m., following the exact route outlined during the planning session. Within seconds, The elevated catwalk came alive with simulated enemy fire. The team bunched up, exposing themselves to multiple angles. Blue-tipped rounds splattered across their armor. A casualty count was called. The run ended in under 2 minutes. The next two teams repeated the same mistake. Each group moved predictably, charging straight into the open corridor without securing the high ground. The results were identical: poor dispersion, slow response, and zero situational awareness. Frustration spread through the ranks as the morning dragged on. Sweat ran down faces under helmets. The sound of failed assaults echoed through the air like a metronome of bad decisions. Then, it was Vance's turn. His confidence showed in every movement. He barked orders, rushed the formation, and led from the front. Loud and aggressive. His team followed too closely, their spacing tight enough for one grenade to end them all. The moment they hit the main door, simulated fire erupted again. Within 30 seconds, half the team was marked as casualties. He cursed, shouted for cover, and finally called a ceasefire. Silence settled over the range. Captain Hendricks stepped forward for a debrief, asking what went wrong. No one spoke. The flaw was obvious, but no one wanted to say it aloud. A range officer finally suggested a demonstration to show an alternative route. Hendricks turned toward Emily. His tone was curious, but measured when he asked if she believed she could do better. Emily met his eyes and answered simply, she could. The range went quiet, every head turning toward her. The desert heat pressed down as if holding its breath. Something was about to change. The range had gone quiet except for the wind cutting through the open desert. Captain Hendricks gave the nod to the range OIC. And a moment later, the call came across the loudspeaker. Range hot. All eyes turned toward Emily Carter as she stepped forward. The heat shimmered off the ground. The sound of distant cadence, calls fading into silence. She adjusted her helmet, tightened the straps on her plate carrier, and ran her fingers across the receiver of her M4A1 carbine. The weapon was clean, precise, loaded with simunition FX blue-tip rounds. She checked her safety, her optics, and her magazine seating with the rhythm of muscle memory. Every movement was deliberate. The range safety officer gave her a final nod. She nodded back once, steady and focused. The timer beeped. She moved instantly, dropping low and cutting across the terrain. The drainage ditch was narrow but deep enough to hide her outline. Dust lifted behind her boots as she advanced, using short bursts of speed to close distance. From the elevated catwalk, two targets waited. She paused, raised her rifle, and fired two controlled pairs. Each shot hit center mass, the blue paint marking clean hits on the plywood silhouettes. The first threat was gone before most of the crowd realized she had engaged. She didn't look up. She just kept moving. At the compound's edge, she stayed in shadow, her breathing even, eyes scanning windows for reflection and movement. Instead of heading for the front entry like the others had, she slid toward the blindside window. She broke the angle, crouched, and rolled through. The sound of her landing was barely audible. Inside, the light was dim. She pied the first corner slowly, rifle steady, muzzle always at chin level. A target appeared left. 2 rounds. Another in the center corridor. Failure drill. 2 to the chest. 1 to the head. The third target moved right presses, and she adjusted without overcorrecting, firing on the move. Each round struck cleanly. Hairform never broke. The crowd outside watched in silence, as her movements showed everything the morning's failures had lacked. She flowed through rooms like water. Economy of motion. No wasted steps. No hesitation. She located the mock hostage in the final room, a sandbag dummy in a chair. She slung it across her shoulder and pivoted toward the exit. The radio crackled with range chatter, but she ignored it. On her exfil route, a final target appeared on the elevated tower, 45 meters out. She dropped prone instantly, pulling the dummy across her body to obscure her position. Her sight picture aligned. 3 rounds. 1 breath. Each hit in sequence. The final buzzer sounded. The timer stopped at 2 minutes and 18 seconds. When she stood, the only sound was the wind and the faint rattle of her spent magazine. 60 soldiers stood frozen, helmets tilted toward her like spectators at a ceremony they didn't understand. Hendricks looked down at his stopwatch, pressed it twice. As if to make sure the time was real, Vance didn't move. He stared at her, mouth half open, hands still at his sides. Emily flipped her weapon to safe, cleared the chamber, and slung it over her shoulder. Her face didn't change. No smile. No nod. Just calm. She walked past them. Through the same dust and sunlight that had started the day, the scoreboard behind her told the story: 0 casualties. 2 minutes and 18 seconds. A perfect run. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The desert sky over Fort Huachuca faded from gold to deep violet. The heat of the day finally breaking. The range was empty now. Quiet, except for the faint hum of a generator and the low rustle of wind through the brush. Captain Mark Hendricks sat behind his desk, papers spread out and a half-empty cup of coffee cooling beside him. The room smelled faintly of dust and metal, the air conditioner clicking on and off. Emily Carter stood across from him, still in uniform, her gear packed and ready by the door. Hendricks rubbed the back of his neck, finally admitting he should have introduced her differently, that the students deserved to know who they were learning from. He asked why she never mentioned her combat record. Emily's answer was calm, measured. She said she shouldn't have to. Her work should speak for itself. Hendricks studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. He said no more, just pulled a paper from the pile and signed it. By the time she left his office, she had been reassigned as the lead instructor for the remainder of the course. Outside, the night had cooled. The stars hung over the range like scattered flares, and the silence felt clean again. The next morning, everything had changed. The same soldiers who had once mocked her now straightened their posture when she passed. There were no whispers, no smirks, only quiet acknowledgement. Before the first drill began, Vance approached her. He didn't apologize outright. Instead, he asked her to walk him through the flanking route again. She nodded once and walked him through the terrain, explaining how to move low, use the ditch for concealment, and break the line of sight before the breach. He listened, really listened, his tone stripped of ego. By the end of the week, her methods had become doctrine. Teams began using her route, her pacing, her timing. The pass rate jumped from 42% to 81%. Hendricks filed a commendation, but she didn't think about it. What mattered wasn't her record. It was the quiet shift in the air, the earned respect, the unspoken understanding. Watching the students run the course with precision, she felt the kind of satisfaction that came without applause. The silence now meant something different. It wasn't disbelief. It was respect. The final morning at Fort Huachuca came quietly. The desert light was soft, stretching long shadows across the empty range. The air carried the faint echo of cadence calls from the drill field, a reminder that life on base never truly stopped. Inside her quarters, Emily Carter packed her gear with methodical care. She folded her OCP uniform, wiped the fine layer of dust from her M4A1 carbine, and returned it to the armory one last time. Her helmet went next, followed by her plate carrier. At the bottom of her bag, she placed her patrol cap, the one with the faded stitching that still read Ghost. That small detail felt heavier than any medal. It reminded her of every place she'd been, every test she'd passed, and the quiet road she had walked between war and peace. The door opened behind her. Ryan Vance stepped in. No smirk this time. No edge. He looked different, humbled. He thanked her for what she taught him, admitting he had misjudged her from the start. She shook his hand, steady and sure. She told him it was never about being right or wrong. It was about being ready when it mattered. He nodded, understanding more in silence than words could ever say. Outside, the day had begun to warm. The mountains glowed pink under the rising sun. As she drove past the range, the radio played low. An old song that matched the rhythm of the hum she remembered from the MH-47 rotors in Helmand. She thought about the people who would forget her name in a few weeks, the course that would continue without her, and the lessons that would stay. That was enough. She didn't need recognition. She just needed the next generation to move better, think faster, and believe that skill had no gender. When she reached the highway north, the landscape widened into open sky. Montana waited miles ahead, quiet and steady, the only home that ever felt real. As she drove into the light, the desert disappeared behind her, leaving only the sound of the engine and the simple truth she had always lived by. Sometimes the loudest victories are the ones won in silence.